On Sunday, August the 30th this year, 2020, will mark the 20th anniversary of the last Mass that was concelebrated within the former Franciscan church here in Drogheda. And that Mass was concelebrated by the renowned Father Ulic Troy, and it brought to an end 760 years of occupation in Drogheda by the Franciscan Order. It first come to Drogheda in the medieval period and had stayed in around the town even throughout the hardened penal days of the 15th, 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, hidden behind closed doors, concelebrating Mass. But they never really moved too far away from their original foundation. It ended here on July the 30th in the year of the millennium 2000 with Father Ulic Troy concelebrating the final Mass. But today we will take a walk and see the location of the origins of the Franciscans at Drogheda, and so we will go to the establishment where they first established themselves along the north bank of the River Boyne in the medieval period. So here we are then on the site of the original foundation of the Franciscan Friary. The Franciscans were one of the new European monastic orders that arrived in Drogheda after the coming of the Normans. So the first of these new monastic orders we would have gotten in the medieval period were the Cistercians, followed by the Augustinians, the Dominicans who came in 1224, and then in the year 1240 we have the arrival of the Franciscans, and it's here right along the north bank of the River Boyne, and in this area behind me today would be the Drogheda Social Welfare Offices, and we can see the Mayoralty House in the background. And it's from the Mayoralty House in the background almost to where we are today with the building there known as Pine World. It's in this particular area where the Franciscans had first set up their friary. And it was a pretty big friary, established in 1240, and in the year 1242, under the reign of King Henry, he actually grants them a royal grant of money to purchase a number of habits for the community here in Drogheda. So it's a substantial monastery. We then find how big it is. You get to know the figures how big it is when it comes to the middle of the medieval period. So in the period of the plague known as the Black Death, which came about in 1347, 1348, and we get figures from the history of the Franciscans here at Drogheda that they lose 25 of their members. The Black Death that spread across Europe in the winter of 1347 wiped out about a quarter of the population of Europe. And you can see by the number of Franciscans who lose their life here in Drogheda, numbering 25, that it was a substantial order having to lose that amount of people. And what happened was, because they were bordered on the boundary was the river, during excavations in late 1997, 1998, in which I worked on here, we found the remains of the Franciscan Friary, and we actually found positions for cranes to be used to lift off merchandise from the river. And we also found an inlet from the river, so that it appeared, and from records, it appeared that boats could actually come from the River Boyne and come right into the actual friary itself to deliver the merchandise. And it's because of the result of this being located along the river that the Franciscans are really in trouble during the period of the Black Death, because of course they don't know what's causing it, or more particularly what's carrying it. And of course what carried it into Drogheda during that period was the merchant ships that was coming in. And the Franciscans are right at the forefront of it here. They survive here in this location along the north bank of the River Boyne until the closing of the monasteries by Henry VIII. And Henry VIII closes the monasteries in 1539, 1540, that kind of period after 1536. Anyone who was now a friend of Rome was not a friend of the Church of England, and so the monasteries and the churches and chapels in Ireland were closed down. The monastery here, the friary at Drogheda, was closed down in the summer of 1539. And the following March, in March of 1540, Crown surveyors return to the friary here, and the last guardian, a man called Richard Mullane, he formally surrenders the monastery, the friary, in March of the year 1540 to Crown surveyors. Crown surveyors again return in October to evaluate the premises in October of the year 1540. And they speak here about how much the buildings are worth, how many chapels are here, the size of the church. It's interesting that the church, they put a valuation on the church within the friary here, and they put a valuation on the church of £2.66, but they ordered the church actually to be knocked. And the church would have stood almost just in front of where today's social welfare offices is. During the building of those social welfare offices in the later 1960s, it wasn't a time for preservation or for archaeologists to be employed, but workmen that were here found a substantial amount of human remains underneath what now would be the social welfare offices, indicating that it was the cemetery of the Franciscan Friary. When the Crown surveyors also came here in March of 1540, they speak about a chapel which was worth a lot of money. To them it was worth £6.66, which was a substantial amount in the mid-16th century. They talk about it having highly decorated roof. There's also stables here, there's forges, there's outhouses, there's gardens outside the town wall. So we're almost dead in line with the town wall as it came down from Laurence Street. And right in the middle of what now is Merchants Quay, which was substantially reclaimed land in the 18th century, but right in front of the roadway now, which would be Merchants Quay, stood St. Catherine's Gate. So we had Laurence's Gate coming down to the river, and right here at the river's edge we had another medieval town gate, which was Catherine's Gate, and that gate was taken down after the closing of the monasteries. So along with the gardens and the orchard, they were then let at 15 pennies per annum, and two people took the rent of those outbuildings, gardens and orchards, and bought the stables from the Crown surveyors after the friary or the monastery had been closed. And those two people who got possession of the rent at 15 pennies per annum was a woman called Catherine Simmons and another local man, which his name was William Darcy. So after the closing of the monasteries, the Franciscans then, having been here from the year 1240 to 1540, they had to go into hiding because in comes the penal days. And the penal days last then throughout the remainder of the 16th century, into the 17th century and on into the 18th century. And for that reason, because Mass was subdued and the penal days was in, they had to administer the faith in secret. And because of that, the Franciscans still continued to exist in the Drogheda area, and they moved from place to place, mostly hidden in behind buildings, in behind false walls where they would say Mass and confirm people into the Catholic faith and so on. And we will go now and have a look at one of these places of where they moved around during these penal days. In fact, from the river's edge when they first set up, they never really moved very far. From here, it's only about 150 metres back to what now is the Highlanes Gallery, which became the last residence of the Franciscans in Drogheda. But we will go and have a look at a couple of these secret places where the Franciscans were administering the faith during the harsh penal days, particularly of the later 16th, 17th and 18th century. After the closing of the monasteries by Henry VIII in the mid-16th century, the Franciscan Order had to move around in secret to continue practicing their faith and to administer the faith to the Catholic congregation of Drogheda. If they were caught administering such faith, there would have been serious implications for the Franciscan Order. So what they done was they would move around in secret, and one of their secret places where they continued to say Mass to the faithful and administer the faith was in this location. So just beyond the arch here, we know they were here in the mid-18th century. There's several references to them being hidden around this area before that, but in 1744, from their own documents and diaries of Franciscans, we know that they are hidden beyond this archway here. This was formerly the site of the old customs house which fronted onto the river. So again, the old customs house was knocked in 1959 after a fire, and in turn was built the social welfare offices fronting onto the river. So this customs house was built around the same period of time as the Mayoralty Street, again at the end of this particular lane. And the customs house was built in around 1740. It appears on a map of Drogheda, 1749 map of Drogheda by Joseph Ravel, shows the new customs house at that point. That's 1749, but we know by 1744 that they are tucked in behind the customs house. So somewhere beyond this archway, where there was old corn and flour buildings, they were practicing their faith. And they speak about the lane here adjacent, which runs up to this archway. Today it's known as Bessixwell Lane. And this lane, which come from Shop Street, originally came into the Franciscan monastery while they were here in the medieval period. So Bessixwell Lane was formerly known in the medieval period as the lower lane to the Friars Minor, which was the friary of the Franciscans. It later became known as Horner's Lane, and then eventually became known as Bessixwell Lane. And while it was Horner's Lane, it's marked as Horner's Lane on Ravel's map, and it shows the lane coming up Bessixwell Lane, which is known today, and running right up to a place called the Broadstone Well. And the Broadstone Well, it was originally a fountain. It's definitely mentioned in the mid-17th century, and then it's known later on as the Broadstone Well. So it was located in behind here, and the Franciscans speak about it. And it says at that time, in 1744, that 4 Franciscans were administering the faith in Drogheda, tucked into an old building behind the actual customs house. So this is the site that they were, one of the sites that they were preaching and practicing the religion during the harsh penal days. This is an interesting plaque which is here behind me on the wall, and the inscription on the plaque is saying that this gate is locked at night time and that the key has to be held in the tollsel. What this plaque is referring to is the town wall came down at this location and ran to the river. So the town wall that linked Laurence's gate came down south towards the river, and at this point here, this lane was known as the Upper Lane, originally in the medieval period. This particular lane, today it's Bachelor's Lane, it was formerly known as the Upper Lane to the Friars Minor, that of the Franciscan Friary, during the medieval period. And hence the town wall coming down would have having a gate right in the middle of today's Bachelor's Lane, which allowed the Franciscans come through their own wall gate out into what would be then, on the east side of it, the gardens and the orchard. So running out towards today's Constitution Hill and towards the North Strand is where the gardens and the orchard were of the original medieval Franciscan Friary. During the penal days, as I said, they were moved around different locations, hidden from the sectarian elite. They would have been in severe trouble had they been caught preaching the Catholic religion. And so they moved around in secret. But the plaque actually has an 18th century lettering which indicates that the town walls and the gates only really came down in Drogheda. 6 of them were knocked between 1789 and 1810, and during that period of the late 18th century, much of the town wall was also knocked. And it's indicating, that plaque, that this gate has to be locked at night time and the key held in the tollsel, is indicating that the town wall, which ran down through this part in the later 18th century, had the actual wall coming down and the actual gate of the original Franciscan medieval friary still attached at that particular point. The next place we find the Franciscan Order is in this location here. So on the junction of Bachelor's Lane, formerly the Upper Lane to the Friars Minor, which was the Upper Lane to the original Franciscan Friary. So again, as you can see, they're not moving too far, even though they have been suppressed since 1540 at the closing of the monasteries, and they are hiding around the place during the penal days. In 1798, we know from their diaries and from the Franciscan history that they are located here, right on the junction, formerly known as Kezer's Lane. Today it's known as the Highlanes Steps. It was formerly known as Kezer's Lane, and it's a medieval name and a medieval lane. And we find that in 1798 that they They have and they haven't permission to preach now. The penal laws are almost at their end. The foot has been lifted off the pedal, so to speak. Maynooth has been built by the British, 1795, and Catholic masses are again allowed to be said. In fact, by 1796, we have St. Peter's first church, Catholic church, built in West Street, on the site of today's Catholic Church in West Street. So churches were allowed to be built again, but again, the sectarian elite who were in charge of places such as Drogheda, although they allowed masses be said in some capacity, they didn't really want to see the churches and church spires and Gothic arches in their face, so to speak. So in 1798 you find the Franciscan Order down here at the bottom of Kezer's Lane and the junction of Bachelor's Lane, and they're tucked in behind this later wall. And here was an old corn store, and also adjacent to it was some old stables, and there was also an old forge. Plenty of noise going on. And we find that in behind here they begin to build a new church within the old corn store. By 1806 there's a number of Franciscans tucked into the old corn store, and they're making improvements into the church. So the corn store is gradually changing from a corn store into that of a small chapel, which is built in the lower end of the hill as you walk up the hill towards Laurence Street. So we have a very small chapel by 1806. Improvements are being made, and there's references in the diary of one of the Franciscans which show that they have got a new altar, they've got a new organ, and they've got a new bell, and that they actually hang their bell in behind the chapel or the old corn store, and they hang the bell from an old fruit tree that's actually in the garden. By the time it comes into the second decade of the 19th century, you have the arrival back in Drogheda from Rome of Dr. Patrick Curtis. He was born in Gormanston in County Meath in 1744, had studied in Rome and became the rector of the Salamanca College in Rome by the later 18th century. He saved a number of British soldiers from certain death during the Napoleonic Wars, and particularly the Peninsular Wars of the early 19th century. And because of that, he becomes a great friend of the Duke of Wellington. So on the return to Ireland in the second decade of the 19th century, Curtis is seeking to become the Archbishop of Armagh, and helped by the Duke of Wellington, who sends a word to the Pope of Rome and the bishops in Rome. Curtis duly becomes the Archbishop of Armagh in 1819. And he resides in Drogheda. He resides here in Fair Street, and he's very much a friend of Daniel O'Connell, who's pushing for Catholic emancipation, and eventually Wellington becomes Prime Minister and Wellington allows for Catholic emancipation. So there's a huge connection between the Duke of Wellington, Daniel O'Connell's visit to Drogheda, and Dr. Patrick Curtis, who was the Archbishop of Armagh here in Drogheda from in 1819 until his death in 1832 in Fair Street. Dr. Curtis was buried beneath the high altar of St. Peter's Old Church in West Street. But Curtis is really pushing for funding and getting support from the townspeople to support the new chapel here at the base of Kezer's Lane in the early 19th century. We also find here that in the early 19th century, in the second decade, the organist here is a man called George Butterley. He's an organist from George Street. And that's of interest because when they eventually then go to build their new and final church on the top of the hill facing onto Laurence Street, the architect is none other than a man called George Butterley. Whether he's the same George Butterley, not quite proven at this stage. A few more points about the old church that was built into the hill here as well in the early 19th century. There was measurements given of it, and it measured only 53 feet by some 19 feet in width. And also up along Kezer's Lane, facing the church, was a surgery and advice centre, and also an advice centre for the Catholic poor of the town, which was run by a surgeon, free gratis, a man by the name of Patrick Darby. So the church remained here with improvements being made to it, and so the authorities knew it was here, yet it wasn't to be seen. It was not only built into a corn store, but it was built and tucked into the base of the hill. And that plays a major factor when eventually the church was built then in the later 1820s, the church we know today, which is that of the Highlanes Gallery. So we'll go up to where that church was built in the later 1820s. Now we are on the site of the last of the buildings that the Franciscan Order had established in Drogheda. By the end of the 1820s, work is about to be carried out on the church that we see here today, the Highlanes Gallery. In 1794, a local man was born. His name was Anthony Nugent Dardis, native of Drogheda. He went to school in the local grammar school here across the road from the Highlanes Gallery, and then he studied in Rome. And after he'd finished his studies in Rome, he returned to Drogheda in 1825. And very soon after that, he becomes the guardian of the Franciscan Friary. That's the old chapel built into the bottom of the hill at the bottom of Kezer's Lane. So Father Anthony Nugent Dardis becomes the guardian of that old chapel in around 1825, 1826. But his heart is set on only one thing. From his own magnificent diaries, he states that he'd wished that he could build a magnificent church and dedicate it to the Franciscan Order, and that he would be at the head of it. That was his only aim, that was his pure ambition. And he began to collect funding from the townspeople with the backing of Dr. Patrick Curtis, the Archbishop of Armagh, during the later 1820s to establish a new church. And at the entrance here on Laurence Street, during that period, there was a number of old buildings, there was a number of old corn stores, there was a couple of houses, and hence that the old chapel couldn't be seen then in public eye from Laurence Street. There was also a tavern almost at the top of Kezer's Lane with the junction of Laurence Street, almost at the entrance to the Highlanes Gallery today. And that was a tavern called the Blue Bell Tavern. So Curtis got permission and managed to get the funding together. By the end of the 1820s, he had pulled down a lot of the buildings here fronting onto Laurence Street, including that of the Blue Bell Tavern. And he began to build his new chapel. In 1829, by September, he had enough funding collected. And in October 1829, he decided then that the plans were ready to build not only a new chapel into the base of the hill, but also to build the upper story, which we can see today as we enter into the Highlanes Gallery. In April of 1830, the old chapel, which was formerly built into the hill at the bottom of Kezer's Lane, was pulled down and destroyed. And the new chapel was built in its place. And the new chapel actually opened, and Mass was first said here by Father Anthony Nugent Dardis, the native of Drogheda. Mass was first concelebrated here on August the 22nd in the year 1830. So again, this year, 2020, marks that to be the 190th anniversary of the first Mass that was actually said within this chapel. Opened, Mass first said, August 22nd, 1830. Improvements were still made with the buildings on either side of it. And in the 1840s then, a new friary house was also erected under the directorship of Father Anthony Nugent Dardis. So old buildings were knocked to the east of the chapel here towards Lawrence's Gate, and a new friary house was built. Improvements continued to be made. And throughout the later 1850s, the Franciscan Friary here at Drogheda was known to be the finest Franciscan friary in the country. It actually had people coming to study, to preach and administer the faith here in Drogheda from as far away places as Belgium, France, Spain and Italy. And it was really a thriving friary by the mid-1850s. Father Anthony Nugent Dardis had done a tremendous amount of work. While he was growing up as a kid in Drogheda, whether he had attended some Mass services in the old hidden chapel at the bottom of the lane cannot be quite certain. He doesn't mention that in his diaries. Having gone to school across the road in the grammar school, was he aware that Mass, hidden Mass to some extent, was being said at the bottom of the lane? And did he, perhaps did he attend it at some stage? But he is renowned, and he is the man responsible for what you see today in the chapel having been built and opened in the year 1830. Improvements continued to be made the whole way through the later 19th century. Father Anthony Nugent Dardis himself passes away on the 17th of May in the year 1868, and he was laid to rest in the vaults of the chapel which he himself had directed to be built. Throughout the early parts of the 20th century, work continued to be improved on the chapel and the friary house. And it was found then throughout the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, the walls were beginning to crumble, not only in the friary house, but they were beginning to crumble even in the chapel. Heating was badly needed, plumbing was badly needed, electric was badly needed, and every work that was carried out they were finding that the walls were crumbling, the floors were crumbling. Major work needed to be done, but trying to gather money wasn't easy for the Franciscan Order. So new plumbing was installed, a new altar was installed, electricity was installed, running water, new seats, new flooring, new ceiling. So throughout the 20th century, major improvements were carried out. There was once a larger tower here onto the church, which stood here since 1830 at the time of Father Anthony Nugent Dardis. And the place was so bad that by the mid-1960s, it was thought that it would become ruinous and that the Franciscans were beginning to look for a new premises. The Drogheda Corporation offered them Whitworth Hall in 1967, and the Franciscans took up that offer. Again, the Whitworth Hall was next to the Drogheda Grammar School here on Laurence Street and just a little bit up the street here from the Friary. However, after 2 years in 1969, this new move came to nothing and the Franciscans remained here. In 1971, a survey was undertaken of the whole premises and it was found to be in a really bad, ruinous state and that the tower itself was on the verge of collapse. It was also stated that as far back as 1933, that the statue had fallen to somewhat and a hand of St. Francis had actually fallen to the floor, along with some rubble from the tower. In 1972, that tower was actually taken down. So the tower was truncated to where you see the size of it today. Originally had been a taller tower, but because of the conditions in the 1970s, it was thought best to take some of that tower down. And so in 1972, some of the tower was actually taken down. Another move was made in 1980 by the then Archbishop of Armagh, Cardinal Tommaso Fee, and Cardinal Tommaso Fee had, in September 1980, a new parish had been formed outside of Drogheda called the parish of Mel. Mel had formerly been part of the parish of Mellifont and also Tullyalan, but in September of 1980 it became an independent parish of its own right, totally separate from either Drogheda, Mellifont or Tullyalan. And it was offered by Tommaso Fee up to the Franciscans to move from Laurence Street to a new premises in Mel. Again, by 1986, no moves had been made to do this and they continued to remain here at Laurence Street. And throughout the 1990s, they again made strident efforts to continue to improve the conditions at the Friary and of the chapel. However, by 1999, this wasn't to be. They had neither got the funds nor the money, and things were deteriorating and the death knell had sounded. Ironically, at a mass that was held here at the end of July in 1999, the renowned Father Ulic Troy, Franciscan of the Franciscan Order, while he concelebrated Mass here in the pulpit on Sunday the 23rd of July 1999, Father Ulic announced, "We have come to the sad conclusion that we cannot maintain our current presence in Drogheda. If we could in any way have maintained our presence here, we certainly would have done so, but this is no longer possible." That was on the 23rd of July 1999. However, it still survived and lingered on for another year. And finally, on July the 30th, the year of the millennium, in the year 2000, the same Father Ulic Troy came in and concelebrated Mass at 12 noon for the very final time. So after 760 years, the Franciscan Order eventually had left Drogheda.